Well, we have neuroscientists and behavioral scientists and behavioral insights teams, and we have all social media that's on board with this, that's officially pronounced back in November before it supposedly broke out at the meeting that they had to plan the emergency, you see, on a tabletop, scenario, as they called it, with the same characters who were to be in control. And they went through all, and how the people will react, and how they expect them to react, and how they'll lie to them about this and lie to them about that, and even prompt them this way to do that, knowing they'll do the opposite. You're getting used and abused and stimulated. You don't even know it. You see, you're following an agenda unwittingly that the master has laid out for you.
It is vital that our nation discuss and address the threat of pandemic flu now. There is no pandemic flu in our country or in the world at this time. But if we wait for a pandemic to appear, it will be too late to prepare. Scientists and doctors cannot tell us where or when the next pandemic will strike, or how severe it will be. But most agree, at some point we are likely to face another pandemic. A pandemic is a lot like a forest fire. If caught early, it might be extinguished with limited damage. If allowed to smolder, undetected, it can grow to an inferno that spreads quickly beyond our ability to control it.
Because I say governments have laid out nothing, absolutely nothing, about how they're going to... They're ordering the folk to stay home in some places, right? And yet, they aren't telling them how we're going to get food to you or whatever. And do you think that's just a mistake, or they just forgot or something? Everything that happens is very, very deliberate. And professional teams of manipulators, expert manipulators, are working on you, all of you, all the time. And the first thing is to give up all your rights. Okay. 9/11 Part 2. Right? You've got literally goons telling you what to do and how to behave and what you must do next. They're called politicians and mayors and things like that. Just amazing. As they come to the fore, with their amazing and astonishing and astounding declarations of what they're going to do and how you better obey it. If the countries are collapsed, isn't it wonderful of the big unification? As soon as this was announced this was coming, people who were in the World Health Organization, as an example, in the backgrounds of it, but still occasionally public, were rubbing their hands in glee about, this could bring this really forced world government to come into being. Generally call it world governance, but world government, you see. Centralized authority on everything: food distribution, water distribution, energy distribution. The technocrats are loving that because they're in energy, you see. And a new way of living, right down to, do you realize, just like they said at the last climate meeting, how much one person who gets born, and one child, how much they're going to consume in their life and how much carbon's going to get produced too? Oh, it's like a big debt to society before you even start. Well, wait a minute here. Who are these people who are calling you a consumer of goods and a producer of the carbon, compared to themselves? Always keep things grounded, right? They have no more right to tell you how to live, right, as you have about them. But you have the right to tell them to get off your back. As being utter hypocrites, because it seems to me they're alive at the same time, probably eating a lot more than you are, and consuming a lot more than you are, and a lot more goods and electricity and goodness knows what else. When you start getting subservient, yes, they're right. What do you mean them? They're not, are they royalty or something? And if they were, so what? You've been trained at the next step. And yes, out of this will come. I think you get austerity really, really going.
Why did the United States enter into the United Nations? At the end of World War II, 1945, the world was very weary from war. And the folks promoting the United Nations had already set the stage. The leaders, the globalists at that time, members of the Council on Foreign Relations, began during the war referring to the Allies, those of us who were fighting against Hitler, as the United Nations. And so for several years, the American people were constantly told the United Nations is fighting the war against tyranny. When the United Nations was first formed, in 1945, it was called the United Nations Organization, UNO. You look in the old literature, it's referred to always as the UNO to distinguish it from the United Nations of World War II. Now we have formed an organization. This was all part of the plan to make the people of the world, and particularly the United States, more accepting of a global body, a United Nations organization that would gradually assume more and more legislative, executive, and judicial powers, and eventually become a global government. And so when it was formed at the San Francisco conference, the Roosevelt administration had already prepped the American people for this. We were the big obstacle because after World War I, the American people and the U.S. Senate had refused to ratify the League of Nations, which was the first real attempt at a new world order by the globalists who had started that effort even before World War I. So after World War II, constant propaganda on the need to have a global body to prevent another war of any kind from happening. And the U.S. Senate went along with that and ratified the UN Charter. What direction is the UN headed? Most Americans have no idea how vast the United Nations has become. It is a global, sprawling bureaucracy that is being built in country after country, regions of the world, where the United Nations agencies and departments have just really exploded across the globe. This particular issue of the New American Magazine is from 2012. This was the United Nations on the brink of becoming a world government. And we had been talking about that for many decades, but when you visually see it, particularly when you're up close, as I've been in third world countries where United Nations trucks, United Nations personnel, United Nations tent cities, United Nations activities and buildings are all over the place, it becomes very obvious. But what is particularly telling in this issue of the magazine is our center spread, which shows the globe, and we have taken actual UN symbols and their own placements and placed them all on the global map, showing all the different UN activities all over the world, from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the UN military operations, UN Food and Agricultural Organization, UN Refugee Organization, UNICEF, UNESCO, etc. Dozens of UN agencies that have been created and have all become global operations. And particularly in Europe and in the third world and Latin American countries, you see the impact of this. What this is actually is building piece by piece global government by building a bureaucracy which is being funded by the American taxpayers through our dues and through our contributions to the various agencies. And also on this map, which is interactive, when you go into our online version of it, you can click on it and get an exploded, magnified view of each of these features. You see here in the photos the headquarters for all these various agencies, and it is quite amazing. I've been to many of them, and here you have these huge palatial buildings where they have their own restaurants, their own shops and everything. The UN bureaucracy lives in luxury while the third world peoples around them, who they supposedly are helping, live in squalor. And not only do we see this terrible disparity between the UN elites and the people they supposedly are helping, but we see very clearly that these countries are becoming, with our aid, with our taxpayer aid, totally dependent on the UN. The UN is actually taking over their countries. And so you wonder, why do these countries over 100 countries regularly, sometimes 150 countries in the UN General Assembly, constantly vote the anti-American, pro-UN agenda because they're totally dependent on the UN. They've been bribed and bought off by the United Nations. And that is the future that we are funding. And we have quickly built the United Nations into an expanding, centralized government with all these legislative, executive, judicial, police, military powers constantly accruing to this global body. That spells disaster for the United States, for our national sovereignty, and for our independence and liberty if it continues.
But the hype and hype and hype, they've made hay over this incredible hype and terror because the agenda is totally, it's just completely unfurled, right? Here's the real agenda here. We couldn't get it all through the climate change thing and sustainability and sustainable development goals, etc., and you wouldn't stop breeding, and you wouldn't stop consuming things, and you wouldn't go into a post-consumerist society. You're post-industrial, but you wouldn't go into a post-consumer and start eating the crickets and all that and the insects. So we're going to make you go into it through saving you all, by terrorizing you all, by getting you into such debt that you'll never get out of it. And whatever you manage to make for an income in the future is going to be peanuts. And you probably live on peanuts. You may be lucky if you can get some peanuts under a martial law type system. Personally, I'd rather they just got rid of the politicians, just move them out of the way, pay them off, and just have the totalitarians that are managing us all, the technocrats running us, because then you know who's doing it, instead of going through the pretense that the politicians are there to help you, because they're not helping us at all, are they? And they won't listen to the public at all, which proves there's no democracy. Quite amazing, right? I listened to a little clip of a talk given by an ex-deputy Prime Minister of Australia, and he was talking to Peter Hitchens. It was interesting. The man seemed genuine enough. He didn't seem, but again, you'd be misled too, because a lot of politicians are psychopathic. They're beautifully pleasant, but the man, he's listening to this. He's agreeing that this martial law scenario is getting ridiculous, and he's agreeing that it'd be bad for the country and all that. But as soon as he said that he was a true believer in free trade, the penny dropped immediately for me. My alarm system went off, like the Council on Foreign Relations type group, the club, that they always put their own members into government. And the Royal Institute for International Affairs, the British company, or the British group that's the grandparent in them all, and the boss of them all, actually. They make sure that these people are appointed into governments to make sure that the free trade agreements are done. The same free trade agreements that made sure that you can't even make anything in your own country, even to save your own lives. You can't even make swabs or gauze bandages, never mind face masks or medical equipment. That's what happens when you become interdependent, meaning totally dependent on some outsider. And the same politicians signed all the deals for integration. So it's that's really what free trade's all about. Nobody forced the countries into signing. Every politician in every Western country and in the Eastern countries signed on with glee against the wishes of the public. But we never learn, do we? Oh, we're democratic, we've got rights. We're trained and trained and trained always for what's to come. The biggest training mechanism is indoctrination at school for sustainability, and that all parents are bad, and that consumerism is bad. And now you've got anti-fat groups that are all paid again. The leaders are all paid awfully well. They have lifetime salaries and pension funds for them. And the followers are all just angry little youngsters that have been trained to be angry about everything. And they're little armies, you see.
This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words. And yet, I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that. Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe.